Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Mark Twain House's Trouble Begins at 5:30. I am so excited tonight to be talking with the authors of Genus Americanus. But before we get to them, I want to first thank our sponsors, Connecticut Humanities, for their grant that's funded. Oops, sorry. That has funded both the Trouble Begins and Trouble at Home series for the past 9 months, as well as the Center for Mark Twain Studies in Elmira, New York. They've been a longtime supporter of this program. So thank you to them for making this possible. Thank you to everybody in the audience who is here. Most of you have already found the chat on the side of your screen. Feel free to talk amongst yourselves during the program using that chat. But if you have a question for Loren, Alyssa, or Dan, please use the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of your screen. It's right next to the people count. Lastly, also at the bottom of your screen is kind of a greenish teal large button that says your support is vital to the Mark Twain House Museum. Please donate here. Whether it's $5, $1, $500, whatever you feel generous enough to support us with, we are so thankful during this very hard year of COVID. So if you're able, please donate. If not, please still enjoy. All are welcome here. And if you can't donate today, I do hope that you potentially think about buying a ticket, as the Mark Twain House is reopening on Saturday, April 10th. And tickets are on sale via our website. So that is all my housekeeping. I want to welcome Loren and Alyssa and Dan. Thank you all so much for being here today. Loren, I will turn it over to you to talk about your book, Genus Americanus, and how this came to be. Oh, but also, if you want to buy it, there is a link in the chat to buy it from the Mark Twain House gift shop, and I definitely recommend that. So, Loren, I will pass it on over to you, and enjoy.
Thank you, Jody. Thanks for the plug for the book. It's an honor to return to the Mark Twain House for this lecture, even if COVID-19 prevents us from doing it in person. Though the 5 grandkids in my family said that I shouldn't wear this tie, which it's a Mark Twain tie, and well, this is the time to celebrate Mark Twain, so you have it, even if it's tasteless. Journalist Hunter S. Thompson wrote, "Old Americans go out to the highway and drive themselves to death. But my 14,000-mile, 3-month, 28-state drive in 2011 around America, 70th birthday present to myself, was a drive to live, to accomplish 3 things. First, research the Ghigliones, who were rare, and then second, interview Americans in all their diversity about race and other hot-button identity issues. And third, follow the path, both the physical route as well as the intellectual route on matters of identity of our iconic Americans, Sam Clemens, DBA, Mark Twain." Twain, whose father died when he was 11, stopped attending school and started apprenticing at local newspapers. At 17, working as a assistant in the print shop, he started traveling to New York and Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and to those cities, we added others in New England, Boston, New Haven, and Hartford. We also visited Iowa. At 19 and 20, Twain helped his brother Orion put out papers in Keokuk and Muscatine. Here's the Twain who currently resides in Muscatine, a fairly large, handsome guy in a shopping center. Then we headed south and west. Twain became a riverboat pilot on the Mississippi between St. Louis and New Orleans until the Civil War began. At 25, he and his brother traveled from St. Joseph, Missouri to Nevada and San Francisco, and Twain worked as a reporter after he failed as a prospector. We ended our trip in Seattle, the last major stop in the United States before Twain, in his 60s, undertook a world-circling lecture tour to recover from bankruptcy. Twain wrote, there ain't no surer way to find out whether you like people or hate them than to travel with them. I really liked my 3 traveling companions. Mark Twain in spirit. He sits behind me here, and I'm going to put a hat on him just to keep his head warm. And more importantly, Alyssa Karas and Dan Tham, who helped me overcome the myopia of a privileged Pleistocene-era white guy. Alyssa, who had just graduated from Northwestern University's journalism school, had rejected immediately pursuing a prestigious journalism job, the goal to many graduates, especially those like Alyssa, burdened with a large student loan debt. Instead, Alyssa worked 70 to 80 hours a week as our trips well below minimum wage, everything. Navigator, travel agent, copy editor, tech specialist, photographer. She took most of the photographs that you're seeing tonight. An Advil dispenser. Her merry mischievous motto, everything is a good time or a good story. Today, Alyssa is Associate Director of Audience Development at Vanity Fair. Dan Pham, a junior who was taking the trip as a one-credit course, joined Alyssa and me 2 days into our odyssey. He was returning from internships abroad that reflected his interest in reporting on people sometimes cast as the world's outliers. Credit his upbringing. He recalled his time in white bread, heavily Mormon Salt Lake City as a quadruple minority, Asian, gay, Buddhist, and vegetarian, sextuple if you count left-handedness and colorblindness. While Dan achieved in the way most journalism students wanted to achieve, as a senior he would win Northwestern's top broadcast journalism award, he also explored what it means to be an outlier. For a course on Chicago's immigrant and multi-ethnic communities, at one point he found himself in the middle of a protest for Tibetan freedom outside the Chinese embassy. Today, Dan is a producer for CNN in Hong Kong, and we owe him a special debt because while it's about 5:30 here p.m., it's 5:30 a.m. in Hong Kong. Alyssa, Dan, and I interviewed 150 Americans during our trip. To save money, we stayed with friends and alums, rewarding them with a free T-shirt. I hold up the T-shirt. The front, you can see, is Mark Twain, but even more important, perhaps, is the slogan on the back, words from Mark Twain: travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness. An important message. If we weren't mooching from alums and friends, we stayed at Cheap Flea Bags, the America's Best Value Inn in Cleveland, rated by a TripAdvisor reviewer, filthiest hotel in America. Do not stay here. In the limited time we have, we're going to tell you about a dozen of the diverse people we interviewed. We look forward to your questions. I conducted the trip's first interview at the Mark Twain Birthplace Museum in Stoutsville, Missouri, with 61-year-old guide Connie Ritter. She recalled as a child never entering the museum. No one ever told us we couldn't go inside, she said. But we knew we couldn't go inside, and now I work here. She said that at the beginning, I hated Mark Twain because of Nigger Jim. She questioned Twain's use of the African-American character in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, but she came to understand the novel as an assault on racism. In 2010, she added a slavery display to the museum's exhibit to highlight the role of slavery in the area, which had a large number of plantation slaves and lynchings in its history. The display showed, for example, a reproduction ball and chain, a foot wide, 7 3/4 pound, attached by a short chain to a slave ankle that demonstrated how hard it would have been for a slave to escape. When I returned to the museum in 2015, I learned Ritter had retired in December 2014. The museum no longer employed any African Americans. Her slavery display had been taken down, supposedly only for as long as it would take to get proper permission to use the photos in the display. But last week, more than 6 weeks after Ritter's retirement, the slavery display remained in the museum's basement. A museum spokesperson insisted that the slavery display is, quote, definitely on our list to do. But I recalled the words of Isabel Wilkerson in her book, Caste. It's as if the greater the distance we can create between slavery and ourselves, the better to stave off the guilt or shame it induces. After a half dozen interviews in Hannibal, we moved on to St. Louis, where Alyssa had an especially thought-provoking interview.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Loren, for that kind introduction. Some personal news as of yesterday, I have just paid off all of those student loans. Only took me about 10 years. But I would like to tell you guys about Big Mama. So in St. Louis, we picked up an alt-weekly newspaper and we saw a story about a homeless camp called Hopeville. So we wanted to visit, but the first problem was it's a homeless camp, right? So we didn't have an address beyond north of the Arch and next to the river. But sure enough, we did get there. And, there were cats all over the place. There were trash, fires and in trash cans. It was really quite a sight to see this sort of pop-up civilization right next to the river. So we meet a man and we ask him who we should speak to. And he says, "Oh, you'll want to speak to the mayor, Big Mama." And we're thinking, like, the mayor? There's a mayor of a homeless camp? And once again, sure enough, there is a mayor, and her name was Big Mama. And she had such a larger than life personality, and she was a real delight to talk to. She sat the three of us down immediately in chairs, and we had a talk, and she explained Hopeville to us. And I don't want to gloss over the difficult aspects of life at Hopeville. The residents dealt with violence and addiction. Inclement weather could be life-threatening. But it was an example of a community that had created a support system out of necessity when no one else had really stepped in to take care of them. And she told us that the community really came together when it was true or right. And she said the name started out as a joke, Hopeville, like you're going to a homeless camp. You're not going to find hope there. But she said she really did when she got there. And this was such a beautiful story because when I spoke to her in 2018, she had found housing and reestablished her life. So it really was one of those things that sort of had a positive ending. And with that, I will hand it over to Loren to talk about Hal Holbrook.
Yes, one of the difficult things of writing this book is that it was initially 200,000 words long, and the publisher wanted it to be half that. So while we didn't include in the book this interview, when on the death of Hal Holbrook, I felt I really wanted to go back and say something about him. St. Louis was as close as we were going to get to during our trip to a performance of Hal Holbrook's legendary Mark Twain Tonight. Alyssa and Dan had never seen Holbrook perform. So thanks to Alyssa's Red Bull-aided 300-mile round trip to Vincennes, Indiana, we not only saw Holbrook perform, but wangled our way into a post-performance reception with him. He loved the idea of our trip, recommended that we visit Twain's cabin at Jackass Hill in the Sierras, and after a lengthy email exchange, agreed to let me interview him 2 years later at his Hilltop Beverly Hills mansion. I followed up our 2011 trip with numerous trips from 2012 to 2016 because there were just gaps in our trip, or I felt we needed to go deeper than we had in some of the interviews. At any rate, the interview of Holbrook, who died earlier this year, as I mentioned, at 95, took place in the first floor library, dominated by a 3-by-5-foot painting of Holbrook's third wife, Dixie Carter, who had died of cancer in 2010. He had spent the morning before our meeting writing about the last days of Carter, quote, "whom I adored above anyone I've ever met," he said. He was trying to reconcile her Christian faith, her belief in God and heaven, with his what he called hard-nosed New England upbringing. He grew up questioning, not believing. His family, he said, never went to church. A copy of Toni Morrison's book, Playing in the Dark, Whiteness and the Literary Imagination, sat on a small table beside one of Holbrook's favorite chairs. A large Twain research library lived upstairs. The book, based on a series of 3 lectures at Harvard, made clear that Holbrook was a scholar of Twain, not only a gifted actor. As a septuagenarian, I wanted to know why Holbrook, from the time he was 29, chose to portray Twain at age 70. Holbrook explained that Twain, older and bolder at 70, would have said anything by that age the actor wanted to put in his Mark Twain Tonight performances. Quote, "I did not want to do anything that was not authentic," he said. Authentic in every way, including appearance, movement, and voice. While no recording of Twain's voice survives, he interviewed Isabel Lyons, Twain's assistant, and a surviving daughter, Clara, before their deaths. Holbrook's drawn-out drawl was convincingly dilatory, though not the speed attributed to Twain by one jocular journalist, 3 words a minute. Holbrook also refused to include topics in his show, however timely, that Twain did not address in his writings or lectures. Holbrook carefully researched Twain's works. I will look for something that seems as important to be talking about what's going on today, and there's plenty of it. A contemporary event that caught Holbrook's eye was a GQ interview of U.S. Senator Marco Rubio of Florida. The potential presidential candidate answered a question about the Earth's age with a non-answer. I'm not a scientist, man. I think parents should be able to teach their kids what their faith says, what science says. Whether the Earth was created in 7 days or 7 actual eras, I'm not sure we'll ever be able to answer that. It's one of the great mysteries. Holbrook noted that Rubio chose to ignore scientists' conclusion that the Earth is roughly 4.5 billion years old. Why couldn't he answer it, Holbrook said? Because he would alienate his base, the Christian right. I don't like that. So Holbrook was putting together a new piece of Twain materials about the Christian Bible. In the middle, Holbrook said, I put this Twain stuff about evolution just for Mr. Rubio. The subject of lying provoked Holbrook to shout, I get very upset with what I see going on. I can't stand lying. I can't stand lying. I can't stand lying. It makes me so angry. Holbrook said he tried to use his Twain performances to get audiences to think about the complicated issues America faces. You're an older actor. Your head is older. Everything going through your brain is older. It's heavier to carry. It's harder to solve. It's more complicated than it was 40 years ago. He laughed. Everything is just a mess, but that's life. Somebody has to make people think, he continued. He looked forward in 3 weeks, he said, to delivering a message in New Albany, Ohio, a place that I know is overrun by Republicans. I came to my interview of Holbrook with some doubts about Twain's views on race. Twain seemed less enlightened about Native Americans, for example, than about African Americans. And when a reporter in Calcutta, India, asked Twain about the future of multiracial relationships, mixed marriages, Twain said, not the slightest. I asked Holbrook how Twain felt about gays and lesbians. To remain authentic, Holbrook avoided the topic of sexual orientation in his performances because Twain failed to address it. You just didn't deal with it, Holbrook said. When I went to school, we did not address it. It was a private thing. So what do I think Mark Twain would feel about these things? What does he feel about anything that had to do with ignorance and a lack of empathy for other people? Holbrook called the message of Twain, whom he described as my school, my teacher, my everything, a cry for questioning. He feared Americans had stopped thinking about race and other tough topics. They've cemented the walls around their point of view, he said, and nobody gets out and nobody can climb in. Holbrook had no thought of retiring. He and his 2 sisters were abandoned by their parents when he was 2. He hungered for approval, but he said, the thing that gets me up in the morning and allows me to sleep at night is the feeling that I'm doing something that's important to me. I'm not just out there talking to myself, that's for damn sure. After St. Louis, we conducted a dozen interviews in Chicago and then moved on to Cleveland. And Dan talked with Priscilla Cooper.
Hey, everyone. So in Cleveland, Ohio, we met Priscilla Cooper, who's an African-American anti-poverty activist and former welfare recipient. And she told us about sort of the stigmas that accompany socioeconomic deprivation. This was one of the interviews from early on in the trip that really stuck with me, and I think about it from time to time, even now. Cooper, who used to be a truancy officer in the Cleveland School Board, said in her interview, poverty is not just that you're cash poor, you're also culture poor, morally poor, something must be wrong with you. It destroys the person that's poor, but it also destroys the person who assumes that because they have something the poor do not, it destroys their character as well, end quote. In a city where half of all Black women are impoverished, Cooper noted that the very poor of Cleveland are doing the same thing they were doing in slavery. It was a sobering reminder for the three of us as we traveled through the Rust Belt that issues of income inequality and the financial prospects that an American has is inextricably tied to race and gender.
Of interviews in Buffalo, Elmira, New York, and New Haven, we finally reached Hartford. Twain's home, as many of you know, for longer than any other place, from 1871 to 1891. For us, Hartford provided a tale of two cities. Twain's mansion represented an elegant, affluent, older Hartford, but Hartford was also one of America's poorest cities. After an afternoon-long tour of Hartford neighborhoods, Andrew Walsh of Trinity College told us that Hartford's future depended on the contribution and economic impact of immigrants and the education of their children. If we succeeded in raising educational levels, Hartford will continue to do very well, he said. If we don't, Hartford will have real troubles. We also interviewed Professor Carrie Driscoll at the University of St. Joseph about Twain and Indigenous people. I want to hold up her book. This is a plug for her book. Do I have it up right side up? Which was really valuable to me. And Ingrid Mattson, then the director of Hartford Seminary's McDonald Center for the Study of Islam and Christian-Muslim Relations. Dan?
Thanks, Loren. So if you spend any amount of time with Loren, you'll find that one of his catchphrases is that he's always looking to diminish his ignorance. And I had a kind of experience with what that really meant firsthand when we met Ingrid Mattson. It was an ignorance, I think, that's shared with other Americans as well, and also echoed in Twain's time. Many Americans view Islam as an anti-Christian faith and one that's incompatible with the West. In Innocents Abroad, a young Mark Twain portrayed Muslim leaders as bloodthirsty savages. He wrote that their natural instincts do not permit them to be moral. Ingrid Mattson, whom the New York Times called perhaps the most noticed figure among American Muslim women, headed up the Islamic Society of North America and shared her journey of conversion to the faith. Regarding the burden placed on Muslims in the wake of 9/11 to purge radical terrorism from the faith, Mattson said, "We would love to, but we are not in control of those people. More Muslims have been killed by ISIS than non-Muslims." She went on to explain that Islam doesn't have a hierarchical structure, there's no equivalent of a pope, and that American Muslims feel as threatened as non-Muslim Americans by these cult-like terrorists. I realized in the course of the interview that I had brought preconceived notions, and that it speaks more to my ignorance than anything else that I was so struck by Mattson's joviality and candor when we spoke with her. It was sort of an aha moment for me that the history of the United States is often defined by this paradigm of us versus them, scapegoating and excluding whole groups of people in order to tout our way as the best way.
Thanks, Dan. After Hartford and Boston, we headed south to Lexington, Kentucky. Lexington was once the capital of Kentucky's slave trade, and it was our first city in the South. It was the birthplace of Twain's mother, Jane Langston, who married John Marshall Clemens in 1823, and with him owned 6 slaves. In Lexington, Alyssa interviewed Merlene Davis.
So at the time that we interviewed Merlene, she was a columnist at the Lexington Herald Leader, and she used her column to candidly address issues of race. And one of the stories that Davis told us was about her experience of integrating a school as a child. We actually spoke to several women during our trip who had had this experience, and Davis told us about how she actually skipped the 5th grade. And she said, and this really stuck with me, it wasn't because she could, but it was because she had to. She was one of a few Black students to integrate an elementary school in Owensboro, Kentucky. And she said, we all ended up in 6th grade because, as far as I could tell, Mrs. Olive Bopp was the only teacher in the school that would take us, she told us. So she said she had no idea what the 5th grade was like. And when we spoke to her, Davis had a very warm and gregarious personality, But she was not optimistic about overcoming prejudice in America. And she was particularly critical of the reputation of outward Southern hospitality versus how people acted behind closed doors. And she said, I just don't see it as improving. She said, I see it as changing. We got to just step on somebody to make ourselves taller. And I don't know why. And I think, you know, I don't want to speak for Dan and Loren, but we did think about, you know, what are our blind spots a lot on the trip? Where are we doing this in our own lives? Are we stepping on people to try to make ourselves seem taller? So I thought that was an important lesson from Merlene's interview.
Thanks, Alyssa. In Kansas, at the Kickapoo Reservation, Curtis Simon Sr., a member of the tribal council, took us to the Kickapoo Nation School, a K through 12 school with 91 students that was a response to the U.S. and church-sponsored boarding schools for Native and students of an earlier era. Those schools forced assimilation, erased Native culture, suppressed tribal languages, cut off the braids of children, assigned them non-Native names, and rejected Native religious beliefs. Twain never wrote about the Kickapoo, but he called the warrior who headed the Washus of Nevada a demeaning name that sounded a bit like Kickapoo, Hoop-de-doodle-doo. Twain said Hoop-de-doodle-doo shed giant vermin and smelled like a stink pot, thereby perpetuating the stereotype of the subhuman American Indian. We drove off on to Salt Lake City, Dan's hometown, where Dan interviewed Troy Williams.
I knew when we arrived in my hometown of Salt Lake City that we would need to interview Troy Williams, who's unofficially designated as the gay mayor of Salt Lake. Back then, he was the host of a local radio show about grassroots activism. Today, he's the executive director of Equality Utah, an LGBT advocacy organization. As a former Mormon himself, much of Williams' activism was centered around fighting the homophobia that's deeply entrenched in the LDS Church. I remember in July 2009, my last summer in Utah before starting college at Northwestern, when a gay couple was arrested after one kissed the other on the cheek near the Mormon temple in downtown Salt Lake. The whole incident was caught on camera. Williams was outraged when he heard the news. Inspired by the sit-ins of the civil rights movement, he organized 3 so-called kiss-ins at the exact plaza where the gay couple was handcuffed. The rallies he led, attended by both gay and straight couples, lips locked in protest, were aimed at calling out the Mormon Church. For all the differences the Mormons have with the LGBT community and vice versa, Williams said that the two groups have a lot more in common than people would believe. Quote, Mormons and queer people know what it's like to be hated for being different, Williams said, so they ought to have empathy. The Mormons were radical communitarians who practiced a different marital form, aka polygamy. They fled the US in the mid-1800s and settled in the Salt Lake Valley, ensconced in the Rocky Mountains and flanked by desert. When the Utah Territory was incorporated in the United States in 1896, the Mormons felt a tremendous need to assimilate and prove that they were just regular Americans. Williams said that marginalized and persecuted groups tend to show that they've assimilated as good, worthy Americans by finding another group and ostracizing them. They forget their own history of oppression and start to contribute to the oppression of others, Williams said. That's what the Latter-day Saints have done. Since our interview, Williams said a lot of progress has been made in Utah, citing a long-awaited hate crimes law that was passed in 2019 and the banning of gay conversion therapy in January 2020.
We stopped in Virginia City, Nevada Territory, where Twain reported for the Territorial Enterprise, and we played bank robbers and barmaid. Twain wrote about a local parade in which whites were followed by African Americans in order of blackness, light to dark. Quote, it was a fine stroke of strategy, Twain wrote. The day was dusty and onlookers could not tell where the white marchers left off and the black ones began. Mocking whites' belief in their racial superiority, Twain questioned the wisdom of whites being on bad terms with blacks. They have got to sing with them in heaven, or scorch with them in hell someday in the most familiar and sociable ways and on a footing of most perfect equality. I wanted our visit to San Francisco to help us learn more about the people there who are often disparaged, the Chinese immigrants who entered the United States through San Francisco Bay's Angel Island, and the early Native Americans who were called diggers because they supposedly searched for wild roots. Was the similarity between the word digger and the country's most potent racial epithet merely coincidence? The Angel Island immigration station expelled many Chinese on the basis of race, class, and gender. 200 Chinese were stuffed into a 1,000 square foot room. 3 high bunk beds were stripped of the mattresses provided to other immigrants. With the Chinese Exclusion Act, of 1882 in force, many Chinese immigrants lied about their identity, pretending to be the children of Chinese merchants or U.S. citizens. They lived in constant fear of detection and deportation. The life of fear was captured in the Chinese calligraphy it was on earlier on the immigration station's walls. One of them translated, "Sadness kills the person in the wooden building." Angel Island reminded me of an evolution in Twain's attitudes toward Chinese Americans and other people of color. He grew wiser and more empathetic as he aged. Writing from the Hawaiian Islands, he had approved of the exploitation of indentured Chinese laborers. He recommended $5 a month, quote, coolies for California, unquote. But later he outspokenly opposed the mistreatment of the Chinese. He claimed he was fired by the San Francisco Daily Morning Call because of his indignant piece about the street bullies who abused peaceful Chinese. Indigenous peoples had been in the San Francisco area for more than 10,000 years. The cemetery of Mission Dolores, founded by Spanish priests in 1776, reminded us that in an earlier era, the Spanish missions not only forced conversion to obliterate the local Indians' names, languages, and culture, but also helped decimate the area's Native Americans. Vincent Medina, a 27-year-old assistant curator at the mission and a member of the Shoshone Ohlone community, said Spanish priests such as Junipero Serra, founder of the California missions, who was given sainthood by Pope Francis in 2015, saw the missions as utopian Christian communities to help the Indians and save their souls. In reality, the missions were, Medina said, quote, horrible places similar to concentration camps. Once baptized, Indians were held against their will. They were treated as slaves, their land taken, their labor exploited. A detachment of soldiers shackled and whipped those who tried to flee. Unmarried Indian women were forced to work as spinners and weavers when they were not being driven into the mission for mass or lessons in church doctrine. By 1843, Mission Dolores' total Indian population of at least 1,000 had been reduced to, quote, aged starvelings. That experience drove Medina to work at Mission Dolores, where he offered an Indian perspective on the history of the missions. Medina also committed to a larger challenge to change the way the story of the missions was told and taught throughout California in a 4th grade unit on the missions. Some mission curators resisted, but he helped the California Indian Culture and Sovereignty Center develop a website about Indian opposition to the missions. He is determined, he said, to make concrete change happen. Alyssa will recall our encounter in San Francisco with smash and grabbers.
So as anyone who has been on a road trip before knows, sometimes you will encounter some hardships. And ours happened one evening in San Francisco when we returned to our minivan to find glass glittering on the sidewalk and a shattered window. So smash and grabbers had taken our video camera, 2 laptops, my 2 suitcases. We lost videos, photos, notes. We were devastated. But the next morning at the auto body shop, I received a tweet from someone named Kimberly Kills asking where I was. And I don't usually respond to that kind of thing. But I did. And it turns out that she had found late at night on a sidewalk in Oakland my suitcase. And she was like, "Did you mean to leave this?" And I was like, "Oh my God, no, you found my suitcase." So we arranged to meet at a Starbucks, and the story got a little bit more layered as Kills had something personal to say about the identity issues that were such a focus of our trip. So she described herself as a transgender model who performed in adult films, and she labeled her sexual orientation as polyamorous, bisexual. She had been the child of parents who divorced when she was young. And she moved around the country as a military brat. So we are very grateful to her for not only finding but returning my suitcase. And it turns out, you won't even believe this, there was only one missing item of note, and that was my biography of Mark Twain. So no doubt that the robbers wanted to read about Twain's time in San Francisco, which he called, quote, "the most cordial and sociable city," perhaps to learn how they could be even more hospitable to out-of-towners.
Thanks, Alyssa. I wanted our trip to end in Seattle because my Ghiglione great-grandparents, after coming from northern Italian villages to New York City in the 1870s, moved to Seattle around 1900. One purpose of our trip was to explore the identity of immigrants, especially, in my case, Italian Americans. Fortunately, Dan added a whole nother layer by our interviews of Vietnamese Americans. Italian Americans were exploited as strikebreakers in U.S. coal fields, lynched by Louisiana mobs in the 1890s, and regularly vilified by nativist bigots as biologically inferior anarchists. A 1906 Washington Post editorial said 90% of arriving Italians were, quote, "the degenerate spawn of Asiatic hordes, traveling to America to cut throats, throw dynamite, and to conduct labor riots and assassinations." I focused on my own family, beginning with the arrival from Pontedecimo, Italy, in 1872 of my great-grandfather, Angelo Francesco Ghiglione, a barely literate indentured pasta maker, shown here during his New York City days. Eventually, he would run his own pasta company, A.F. Ghiglione and Sons, in New York and then Seattle. As much as I revered the entrepreneurial spirit of my great-grandfather, I especially admired the contribution of his son, Dr. August J. Ghiglione, a Columbia University grad who cared for Seattle's Italian Americans from 1905 until his death in 1949, and served them as Italian consul for the Pacific Northwest from 1907 to 1914. When the Black Hand, a criminal and syndicate, he's, by the way, in the middle of that photo that we just had up, this mask covered and a fairly large nose showing. When the Black Hand, a criminal syndicate formed by Italian immigrants, tried to extort money from other Italian immigrants, Dr. Ghiglione aided police in breaking up the plot. For a time, he traveled with a bodyguard and carried a gun in his car. An explosion at his house caused a front-page headline in the Seattle Daily Times. "Dynamite outrage perpetrated against Italian consular agent Ghiglione." The Post-Intelligencer editorialized about the shame of Seattle, the partnership between the police chief and criminal classes, and the chief's unwillingness to protect Dr. Ghiglione and his family. When a Seattle Times reader disparaged Italian, Chinese, and Japanese immigrants in 1910, Dr. Ghiglione attacked the reader's ignorance and misinformation. He defended immigrants' patriotism and dismissed the reader's call for immigration restrictions as amounting to, quote, "air bubbles." In response to the reader's claim that Italians were violent criminals, Dr. Ghiglione cited a study of Italians in America that concluded, "Generally speaking, they are gentle drudges, honest, faithful, and inoffensive." He foresaw an America enriched and enlivened for generations to come by its immigrants, by people of different races, ethnicities, religions, and visions of what life in the United States could be. Dr. Ghiglione's celebration of immigrants is the perfect prelude, I think, to our trip's last interview. Vietnamese refugees, like Italian, Chinese, and other immigrants before them, face dehumanizing discrimination. Only 36% of Americans wanted to accept Vietnamese refugees in 1975 when the Vietnam War ended, but 875,000 Vietnamese refugees came anyway. Today, at a time when Asian Americans are being subjected by other Americans to verbal and physical violence, including murder, what better time to tell the story of Julie Pham and Giuseppe Anthony Tran? It reminds us that in general, refugees and immigrants do not repudiate, but instead reinforce American values. Dan, will you talk about them?
Absolutely. Thanks, Loren. I was really inspired by Loren's passion for roots research and kind of seeking out every Ghiglione in the United States. So whenever we had the chance, I would suggest that we interview Vietnamese Americans as well, whom we met in Chicago, New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and Seattle. It was a personal motivation for myself to understand the experiences of my parents when they were refugees trying to fit into a new country. Two of the interviews in particular stood out to me. Giuseppe Anthony Tran shared his epic story of escaping Vietnam 6 years after the end of the war on a raft with a dozen other desperate Vietnamese. He recounted the conditions of the refugee camp in Thailand, his adoption by an Italian American couple in Chicago. He called himself an Italian Vietnamese living in America, and his eventual home in New Orleans, where he found kinship and community with the Vietnamese who lived there. Today, he is the parish coordinator for the Mary Queen of Vietnam Church and said that in New Orleans, the Vietnamese community commemorated the 4 decades since the Vietnam War a little differently. Quote, everywhere else they were mourning. Here, we celebrated 40 years of success, evaluating ourselves and seeing what we've done. The other standout interview was with Julie Pham, the managing editor of Người Việt Tại Bắc, the largest and oldest newspaper for Vietnamese immigrants in the US. The Seattleite said, people are really hungry to feel connected. The Vietnamese community is the most linguistically isolated, with the highest percentage of limited English proficiency. The newspaper links people with news of their homeland, Vietnam, and also with local news so they can understand their new homeland as well. As a Vietnamese American myself, meeting people like Julie and Giuseppe helped me understand some of the hallmarks of the immigrant and refugee experience that any American can relate to.
Jody, I don't to open it up to questions. We could talk about our sort of, we had 6 conclusions at the end of the trip, but it might be more interesting to people in the audience to hear their questions and our attempts to answer them.
Yes, and sorry about her today. This is a great opportunity. We have a couple questions from the audience, and this is a great opportunity for anybody else that has questions to put them in that ask a question feature. So the first, and then I have a couple questions if they don't. So the first question is, and this is, I guess, is open to any of you that wants to answer, is, do you believe interest in Mark Twain is waning, either because of the knee-jerk reactions to his use of the N-word in Huck Finn, or for other reasons?
Good question. Well, I'll take a shot at some at part of this. I've been corresponding with an American Studies professor who happened to graduate from the same program, PhD program I did at George Washington, and about an event we're going to hold with George Washington American Studies alums. And in the process of sort of researching what he's doing, I noticed that he and other professors are not letting any students use the N-word in class at all. It's sort of an outlawed word, and you can understand the reasons for it. It's a very powerful term, and of course there are schools now, high schools, that are, I think, rejecting, say, Huckleberry Finn for the same reason, the use of the N-word. There is an edition, a New South edition of Huckleberry Finn that replaces the N-word with slave. And so, you know, I can see reasons, things that are out there that make Twain problematic to some people. But you know, I like to believe that his writing is still so powerful that that it will live on as strongly as ever. But you know, I've given you a couple of examples of why it may be an issue.
Dan or Alyssa, anything to add to the answer of that question?
No, I think Loren covered that quite well.
So the next question is for kind of each of you individually, but the question is, what was the most unexpected part of your trip for each of you? So Loren, do you want to start?
No, I'll let them.
Let them start. All right. Dan, do you want to go? Since you're
Yeah, sure. I'll start. I think you know, one thing that we did on the trip was visit the sites of, you know, some of the darkest parts of American history. So, you know, we went to Money, Mississippi, where Emmett Till was murdered. Also Laramie, Wyoming, where Matthew Shepard was murdered, a gay teenager. And it was interesting to sort of see how a lot of, you know, how whether these events were ever memorialized or commemorated anyway, and sort of it just really made you realize sort of the weight of history in some of these places, and the potential erasure if we don't, you know, make an effort to remember what happened so that we avoid doing it in the future. I also remember going to Marion, Indiana, which was the site of the last lynching in the North. You know, there's a photograph of the lynching that inspired the song "Strange Fruit," which Billie Holiday, you know, made famous. So these kind of places kind of haunt me a little bit, and I think a lot about, you know, how we remember these things and the importance of remembering these things.
And if I could just respond to that before we go to Alyssa, when you guys, so I've been reading the book, and when you guys described that and like playing it as you were like leaving town, the song, like it was such a vivid, like emotional impact for me, just to read it. So I can only imagine that's like the tip of the iceberg for you guys to like go and like dig deep in that history and then listen to that song as like you were driving away. So super powerful. All right, Alyssa.
Well, on a lighter note, I was surprised by how much I enjoyed traveling with Dan and Loren. You know, we're kind of an odd couple, but we had a great time, right, guys?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was just such a delight to really get to know these two people so well. That was incredible to experience that with them. But on a more serious note, I mean, you know, it was an opportunity for me to speak to all sorts of people that I maybe never would have encountered before. You know, and as Dan mentioned, one of the things that Loren said so frequently was, you know, the importance of diminishing your ignorance. And I just realized how ignorant I had been about so many different historical events and, you know, people and people's experience with racism. That was very big for me to sort of take a look at myself as a white American and say, like, just because I have experienced something a certain way, well, that's by no means the default. And that I thought a lot about and still think about to this day.
Great. Loren?
Well, I've had a couple of things. There was something it's gone out of my head that I want to add to what Dan had to say about Marion. Oh, I guess what it was that there was a recent documentary of Billie Holiday, and they showed Billie Holiday singing. It really wasn't singing; it was sort of just orating "Strange Fruit," and it was so powerful. I found myself crying. You know, I just couldn't get through it. It was just so moving. So, yeah, I one thing when we went to Yale Law School, we interviewed women there who in the 1960s and learned about discrimination against them. But in the process, I learned that about a student at the law school, Warner McGuinn, African American law student, that took Mark Twain around campus, and he had, as a student, had to work hard to pay his bills. You know, he waited tables, he collected from overdue bills from students, and so on. And Twain wound up writing to the law school dean about trying to help him, arranging quietly to just cover his expenses through the school. Twain wrote, "I do not believe I would very cheerfully help a white student who would ask a benevolence of a stranger. But I do not feel so about the other color. We have ground the manhood out of them, and the shame is ours, not theirs, and we should pay for it." And, you know, I guess one of the things that I keep thinking about is the kind of connection or similarities between Twain's era at the end of the 19th century, the last half of the 19th century, and our era. You know, the treatment of Asian Americans, for example, since that's in the news right now, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and the violence toward them, and then the violence today. So much to think about when you pick up Twain.
All right, next questions. So I kind of know the answer a little bit to this, having finished your book, but the question is, after all that you've seen, do you feel hope or disheartened?
Do you guys want to answer? I have an answer in the book, but how do you feel?
Yeah, I feel hope. But I will say that, you know, progress is very slow. Sometimes, I mean, we have seen throughout, you know, our trip, and especially right now, it goes backwards, and you really have to fight for it. But I think I will say that based on the Americans that we interviewed and hearing stories of people today, Americans really will speak up when something is not right, and you know, even if it's a small group, you know, they can be loud, and people can still force change. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, but there seems to be still a commitment to changing things, and doing the right thing, as slow as it may be. Dan, what do you think?
So hope, I mean, I think lately these days, it's been more tiring and sort of exhausting and disheartening, really, to be frank, just to sort of, you know, read about these stories that are happening in the States, especially with what's happening in the Asian community. It does seem that, you know, kind of issues of equality and sort of and just our basic democracy, it can be very fragile at times, and it's so easily threatened if we don't kind of band together and do something about it. And I think that maybe one of the biggest things that I took from this trip that we took so many years ago was the importance of just talking to people who don't look like you, and don't have your lived experience, and don't, you know, and who can maybe teach you something about life that you may not have considered. I mean, everyone that we talked to, you know, had a story to tell about feeling marginalized for some reason or another. And I think it's just more important than ever to, you know, to kind of get out of our silos and not, you know, and not be kind of blinded by, you know, our sort of narrow-mindedness.
So I'm recalling a Twain quote. Since we're the Twain House, I've got to read it. The man who is a pessimist before 48 knows too much. If he is an optimist after it, he knows too little. But I'm an optimist, and you know, I've been around a while. I remember, just to take questions about attitudes toward gays and lesbians. I remember in 1990, doing a survey, first ever, of gays and lesbians in newsrooms, and only 13% of them were willing to identify themselves by name. They were afraid for their jobs and everything else too, possible physical violence. So I like to think that there are arenas in which things have changed rather dramatically in the last decade or so. But race remains just such a problem, and it's not just we know Black Lives Matter, but I have to say that one of the things that bothered me most about the trip was my ignorance of Native Americans. I mean, it's not, they're not on reservations in rural areas the way I thought. 70% of them are in urban areas, just to take one factoid. And the discrimination against them, they're really erased in our culture a great deal. And we've just talked about Asian Americans too. So I think race remains, troubling. And I don't know that there's any short-term solution.
Yeah. I worked up at the Abbey Museum in Maine for about a year and a half, and it was all about the Wabanaki cultures and communities. And the mission of the museum, however, was just to have people leave the building knowing the Wabanaki still exist, that they weren't a culture that is in the past. They're still present. And, obviously there was a lot more to the mission, and it was a great museum, but that was like the first step is recognizing that those groups of Native Americans and other groups of Native Americans are still present and thriving and vibrant communities, and not just something in the history book. So I feel that on a deep level, Loren. Loren,
well, thank you. I think it's not only that they exist, but that they're a younger population, a growing population, and they're assuming more responsibility in Congress, more visibility. In the 2018 election, there were 4 elected to Congress. There were only 2 before that. So, things are happening, and now you have an Interior Secretary who's Native American. That's a first. I'm hopeful.
Yeah. All right. So the next question is, how did you decide who to talk to? Did you prearrange them, or did you approach people? Did they approach you? What was kind of the approach to these interviews?
Well, there were a variety of things we did. There were some people we wrote to in advance, and sometimes they answered, sometimes they didn't. In the case of Henry Skip Gates, he did not respond, but we went to his office and wangled our way into an interview. There were other people like the Kickapoo. We were driving down the road and there was a sign for the Kickapoo Reservation, and I was driving and we just turned left into the Kickapoo Reservation, and the people were nice. And we said, look, we explained our trip, and might we talk with you? And they were willing. One thing that Dan, Alyssa, and I have been talking about, I just want to mention is, so I'm about to turn 80, and we've been talking about, maybe putting a series together of mini trips and going back on the road, and maybe interviewing a younger generation of people and seeing how they're addressing these issues. Because I think if there is hope, it's not in my generation. We interviewed Wilbert Rideau, who had been in Louisiana State Penitentiary for more than 4 decades, 11 years on death row. And he said, well, the first thing that has to happen, he says, that people your age and my age have got to die. And then maybe the younger generation will do a better job than we have. So I'd like to interview that generation.
Kind of follow up on that. You mentioned it in your answer, and the next question is, how did you explain your trip to the people you interviewed? When you approached them, what did you say? How did you get them to talk to you and answer all these very personal questions?
Well, Alyssa, can you remember what we said as we walked into the Hopeville? And
we would mention Mark Twain. We would say we're on a road trip. we did mention, we are just talking to Americans about identity issues, and the things that are important to people. So race, religion, gender identity, all immigration, all of these things. And I think we were really surprised at usually how well received we were. I mean, people were told us very personal things, and we're so grateful that they shared their experience with us. Oh, I think you're muted. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, am I muted? Okay. So was an intersex woman in hermaphrodite in Chicago. Didn't want to use her last name because she had been harassed online. But I didn't know anything about intersex and frankly, the lives of transgender people. So, we were very naive, and sometimes in my case, I wasn't really proud of the questions that I asked because I think in some cases, at least in one case, it was offensive to the person we interviewed. But I think we were just honestly trying to learn things, and people, I think if you're honestly, Americans are quite open, I think, if you're trying to understand, and they want to, as to use that term again that I've used, they're willing to diminish my ignorance or our ignorance.
Yeah, and I think that, kind of the longer that we were on the trip, the more we realized that there were so many identities that we barely, grazed the surface of. I remember near the end of the trip, we were in San Francisco and we were interviewing the late Charles Reich, and he was telling us that he's openly gay, but he was saying that the real way he identifies himself now is as a single person, and that this is kind of like a silent minority in America of people who live alone, well into old age, and that kind of made me realize that there's so many other groups of people that we weren't able to talk to on this trip. I mean, I think even say disabled Americans or Americans living with disabilities, there's a lot of ground to cover, and I think that we tried to do our best with the time we were given, but it kind of inspired me to be even more going forward to try to get to know people from all stripes.
Yeah. Well, I'd also say, it's touching on kind of something that Loren just said of, part of it's also putting yourself out there, right? Like you guys had to go and ask uncomfortable questions and acknowledge that maybe you don't have the right words to ask those questions, but you're going to ask it in the best way you know how, and learn from that, and, go on to the next one with a better foundation of how to approach these subjects. And it's such a great learning tool for you guys and for all of us, and everybody trying to work on allyship and all the other things happening in the world today. So I think we have at least one more question. It says, you did not report today on interviews with any anti-people. Did you speak to any on your travels? What was that experience? And I'm assuming this means you kind of touched on people who were, activists and things like that, but not necessarily the other side of that coin.
Well, I don't recall anybody that we approached with the intention of getting somebody who was sort of anti equality or anti whatever. I mean, I wrote letters of thanks to people who took us in for a night and put us up, and one of them wrote back a questioning letter about our trip, and basically using some of the expressing some of the feelings that are associated with President Trump, and but I don't recall. If listen, Dan, if you recall, maybe you had experience with somebody.
We did interview a Catholic deacon who I think was maybe didn't share our views about women and the LGBTQ community, I would say. But we, we listened to him and, disagreed. But Dan, do you remember that? Do you have anything?
Yeah, I think that was probably the only interview that really I felt uncomfortable in. And the others, I think that was maybe it. But I guess, in recent years that we've really seen the rise of white nationalism in the US. That's a topic that we didn't touch at all. In any, as in we didn't talk to any white nationalists, but of course, issues of white supremacy definitely raised, was present in a lot of the stories of the people that we talked to.
Yeah, and just for reference, this your trip was in 2011, is that correct? Yeah. So
yes, although we followed up a little bit and with other trips in 2012 to 16, but yes, that's correct. Yeah.
So, and the last question that we're going to end with tonight, first, thank you, all three of you, for being here. But the last one that we're going to answer in the thing is to all of you. What was the first Mark Twain book you read that got you interested in Mark Twain, or what is your favorite Mark Twain book?
Well, I remember reading Twain as a kid, but I don't remember. I mean, I think I started with, as many kids do, Tom Sawyer, and I like Roughing It for obvious reasons, since we were following the path, and I've been reading his reporting from Hawaii and enjoying it. But I guess I'd say Huckleberry Finn is for me the most still the most powerful. And I just I have I have a 24 volume collection I started reading a long time ago, and I still go back to it. So I'm not giving you a good response here because I'm too much the fan.
It's probably the response most of our audience would give too. Dan?
Yeah, I agree with Loren. It's got to be Huck Finn for my favorite. But I was definitely pleasantly surprised by the passages of Roughing It that we read when we were out west. I celebrated my 21st birthday in a ghost town in Nevada called Unionville, where Twain prospected for gold. So yeah, that was really special.
Yeah, it's roughing it for me too. I grew up in the Northeast. I'm from Pittsburgh. And I was just obsessed with the American West once we got there, the landscape, and Roughing It was like sort of the gateway drug.
Nice. Well, thank you all of you so much for joining us. The book is really amazing. I just finished it today. So anybody in the audience who's interested, it is available on the Mark Twain website. We all have our copies. You should get yours too. And Dan, thank you so much for getting up so early in the morning to join us. Alyssa, thanks for doing the PowerPoint. Loren, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you all so much. And thank you again to our audience. And we'll see you in May for the next Trouble Begins.
Thanks, Jody.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.